Frozen breath clouded the cramped cattle car as it swayed through the English countryside, carrying its cargo of defeated German soldiers toward an uncertain fate. Hans Mueller pressed his face against the small barred window, watching the grey December landscape roll past while his fellow prisoners huddled together for warmth on the straw-covered floor. "They say the British hang prisoners," whispered Friedrich Weber, the youngest among them at 19, his voice barely audible above the rhythmic clacking of wheels on track. "My sergeant told me they torture you first, make you beg for death." Klaus Richter, still wearing the torn uniform of a corporal despite 3 days of captivity, spat into the straw. "What do you expect from a nation of colonial butchers? They've been oppressing people for centuries. We're just the latest victims of their cruelty." Hans said nothing, but his weathered face betrayed years of combat experience that had taught him to separate fear from fact. At 28, he had survived the Eastern Front, witnessed the retreat from France, and endured the desperate final battles in the Ardennes. He had learned that reality often differed from what officers told their men. "I heard they starved prisoners deliberately," continued Friedrich, wrapping his thin arms around his knees. "Feed you just enough to keep you alive for forced labor, work you to death in their factories. The Führer warned us about this," Klaus added, his voice carrying the fervor of true belief despite their circumstances. "Democratic weakness breeds cruelty. They have no honor, no code of conduct. They'll treat us worse than animals because that's what their Jewish-controlled government demands." Other prisoners in the car murmured agreement, sharing similar stories they had heard from retreating comrades or read in propaganda leaflets. Tales of Allied brutality, of prisoners beaten to death, of starvation rations designed to break German spirit. The stories had circulated through their units for months, growing more horrific with each telling. Hans watched the countryside change from farmland to industrial areas, noting the organized efficiency of British rail transport, the well-maintained infrastructure despite years of war. Everything appeared orderly, systematic, professional, not what he would expect from the chaos and cruelty described in the stories. "Look at their cities," he said quietly, pointing through the window. "No signs of collapse, no breakdown of order. Their trains run on time, their signals work properly. These people know how to organize. Organization means nothing when it serves evil purposes," Klaus replied sharply. "The more organized they are, the more efficiently they can torture us. German efficiency in service of the Reich builds civilization. British efficiency serves only oppression and exploitation." Friedrich pressed closer to the window, staring at the foreign landscape with wide, frightened eyes. "I just want to survive this. I want to see my mother again, work on our farm. I never wanted to be a soldier." "Weakness," Klaus muttered. "That attitude is exactly what got us captured in the first place. If every German had proper fighting spirit, we wouldn't be in this situation." Hans studied the young private's face, seeing his own son's features reflected there. The boy had been conscripted barely 6 months ago, thrown into the final desperate battles with minimal training. He had surrendered along with Hans's entire unit when their position became untenable, ammunition exhausted, no hope of reinforcement or retreat. "Fighting spirit doesn't stop artillery shells," Hans said calmly, "and it doesn't create food when supply lines are cut. We did our duty as soldiers. Now we face whatever comes next." The train began to slow, brakes squealing against metal wheels. Through the window, Hans could see guard towers and barbed wire perimeter fencing. Wooden barracks stretched in orderly rows beyond the wire, smoke rising from chimneys in the cold air. British soldiers in clean uniforms stood at attention near the platform, rifles held properly. No signs of the chaos or brutality the prisoners expected. "This is it," Friedrich whispered, his voice cracking with fear. "Remember," Klaus said urgently, "give them nothing. Name, rank, serial number only. Don't let them break you with their tricks. They'll try to seem friendly at first, then show their true nature once they have you isolated." The car lurched to a stop with a final metallic screech. Heavy footsteps approached outside, keys rattled in locks, and the door slid open with a grinding sound. Cold English air rushed in, carrying the scent of coal smoke and wet earth. "Right then, lads," called a British voice in accented but clear German. "Out you come, nice and orderly. No pushing, no running. Just form up in lines of 4. Hans was among the first to emerge, blinking in the grey afternoon light. The British soldiers waiting for them stood in perfect formation, their uniforms clean despite the weather, their weapons held with professional competence. A sergeant with a weathered face and steady eyes approached the group. "I am Sergeant Major Davies," he announced in careful German. "You are now prisoners of war under British authority. You will be treated according to the Geneva Conventions. Follow orders, cause no trouble, and you will be dealt with fairly. Anyone who attempts escape or violence will face appropriate discipline. Is this understood?" The German prisoners nodded uncertainly, still expecting some trick or trap. Hans noticed that the British guards maintained proper military bearing without apparent hostility. Their discipline reminded him uncomfortably of German standards, the same attention to detail and professional competence his own units had once displayed. Processing began immediately with systematic efficiency. Names recorded, personal effects catalogued and stored, medical examinations conducted by British Army doctors who treated wounds and checked for diseases with clinical professionalism. Each prisoner received a number barracks assignment and explanation of camp rules delivered in fluent German by British personnel who had clearly prepared for this task. Hans found himself assigned to Barracks 12, along with Friedrich and Klaus. The building was simple but weatherproof, with real beds, clean blankets, and a small stove for heat. Not luxurious, but far better than the conditions they had endured during their final weeks of combat. "It's a trick," Klaus insisted, as they settled into their assigned bunks. "They're softening us up, making us comfortable before the real treatment begins. Tomorrow, they'll show their true nature." Friedrich sat on his bunk, staring at the clean blanket in his hands. Maybe they really do follow the Geneva Conventions. Maybe the stories were exaggerated. "Naive fool," Klaus snapped. "You think democratic governments care about international law when it comes to German prisoners? They want revenge for our victories, for the fear we put in their hearts during the early years of the war." Hans tested his mattress, finding it firm but adequate. The barracks were clean, organized, heated against the December cold. Through the windows he could see other prisoners moving between buildings under guard, but without apparent harassment or abuse. Everything appeared orderly, systematic, professional. "We'll know tomorrow," he said simply. "No point speculating when we'll have facts soon enough." That first night, Hans lay awake listening to the sounds of the camp settling into evening routine. Guards walked their posts with regular precision, their footsteps echoing off the wooden buildings. No screaming, no sounds of violence, just the quiet efficiency of a well-run military installation. Friedrich tossed restlessly in his bunk, occasionally whimpering in his sleep. Klaus muttered prayers and curses in equal measure, his faith in Nazi ideology warring with growing uncertainty about their situation. Other prisoners in nearby bunks whispered among themselves, sharing fears and speculations about what morning would bring. Hans had learned during his years of combat to conserve energy and emotion for moments when they were actually needed. Tonight required rest, not worry. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought, and he would deal with it as he had dealt with everything else in this war, with practical competence and careful observation. Dawn came grey and cold, announced by a bugle call that echoed across the camp with military precision. British guards entered the barracks, not shouting or threatening, but simply announcing in clear German that prisoners should dress, make their bunks, and prepare for morning assembly. "Move along, lads," called Corporal Thompson, a middle-aged guard with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. "Assembly in 10 minutes, then breakfast. Keep it orderly and there'll be no problems." The prisoners filed out into the cold morning air, forming ranks under British supervision. Hans noticed that the guards maintained professional distance without apparent hostility. Orders were given clearly and enforced consistently, but without the screaming and abuse that characterized German military discipline. Sergeant Major Davies addressed the assembled prisoners, explaining camp routine, work assignments, and regulations. Prisoners would work 8 hours daily on agricultural projects, receive adequate food and medical care, and be permitted to write letters home under censorship. Religious services would be allowed, as would recreational activities within security constraints. "You are soldiers," Davies concluded, "and you will be treated as soldiers. Behave accordingly, and you will find life here tolerable. Cause trouble, and you will face military discipline. The choice is yours." Then came the moment that would define everything that followed. The prisoners were marched to the mess hall, a long wooden building with tables and benches arranged in orderly rows. British cooks stood behind serving tables laden with food, steam rising from large pots and serving dishes. Hans stopped short when he saw the spread before them. Fresh bread, still warm from ovens, thick soup with actual meat visible in the broth, tinned beef, boiled potatoes, cooked vegetables, margarine, jam, even tea with sugar. More food than his unit had seen in weeks during their final battles. Friedrich gasped audibly, his eyes wide with disbelief. Klaus stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, as he stared at the abundance before them. Other prisoners murmured among themselves, unable to process what they were seeing. Hans approached the serving line cautiously, still expecting some trick or trap. But the British cook simply filled his plate with generous portions, adding bread and a cup of hot tea without comment or hostility. The food was real, substantial, properly prepared. "Are we meant to live off this all week?" Hans asked Corporal Thompson, his voice carrying sarcasm born of disbelief rather than complaint. Thompson smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. "No, mate, that's just for today. Tomorrow you'll get the same again, and the day after that. We follow Geneva Conventions here, which means proper rations for prisoners of war." Hans stared at the corporal, searching for signs of deception or mockery. Instead, he saw only professional competence and what appeared to be genuine human decency. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. "But why?" Friedrich asked in broken English, his voice barely above a whisper. "We are enemies. We fought against you." "You're prisoners now," Thompson replied in German. "That makes you our responsibility." "We don't abuse our responsibilities, lad. That's not the British way." The prisoners ate slowly, cautiously, still expecting some revelation that would transform this apparent kindness into cruelty. But the food was real, substantial, properly cooked. Hans found himself eating more than he had consumed in any single meal for months. Klaus picked at his food suspiciously, as if expecting poison or some hidden trap. "This cannot be real," he muttered. "No army feeds enemy prisoners this well. There must be a purpose, some scheme we don't understand yet." "Maybe," Hans replied, chewing thoughtfully on actual meat. "Or maybe we were told lies about what to expect." "Impossible," Klaus insisted. "The Reich's information services are completely reliable. If they said British treat prisoners brutally, then this is temporary deception designed to lower our guard." Friedrich ate with the desperate hunger of a 19-year-old who had been surviving on minimal rations for months. "I don't care if it's temporary," he said between bites. "Right now, I'm eating real food for the first time since October." After breakfast, work assignments began. Hans found himself assigned to agricultural labor on a nearby farm, along with 20 other prisoners under British supervision. The work was hard but not deliberately cruel, harvesting winter crops and repairing farm buildings damaged by weather and neglect. The British farmer who supervised their work, a weathered man named Jenkins, treated them with gruff fairness. He showed them how to perform tasks properly, expected competent work, and didn't tolerate laziness, but he also brought them tea during breaks and never raised his voice in anger. "You lads know farming?" Jenkins asked in broken German mixed with English gestures. Several prisoners nodded, including Friedrich, who had worked on his family's small farm before conscription. Jenkins put him in charge of a work detail repairing fence posts, showing him the proper technique and trusting him to supervise other prisoners. "Strange," Friedrich confided to Hans during their midday break. "He treats us like workers, not like enemies or slaves. In Germany, we were told British would work prisoners to death in deliberate cruelty." Hans watched Jenkins sharing his own lunch with a sick prisoner who had been excused from heavy labor but still required to work. The gesture was small but significant, suggesting genuine concern for prisoner welfare rather than calculated deception. "Perhaps," Hans said carefully, "we were told many things that weren't entirely accurate." That evening, back in the barracks, the prisoners engaged in heated discussions about their experiences. Klaus remained convinced that fair treatment was temporary deception, but his arguments carried less conviction than before. Other prisoners shared similar stories of British professionalism and basic human decency. "They gave me medicine," reported Otto Schneider, a private who had developed a persistent cough during transport. "Real medicine, not just aspirin or empty promises. The British medic examined me properly, prescribed sulfur drugs and told me to return if symptoms worsened. My work supervisor showed me photographs of his son," added Wilhelm Braun. "His boy is serving in Burma, fighting against Japanese. He said war is terrible for everyone, but soldiers must do their duty regardless of personal feelings." Klaus listened to these reports with growing agitation, Don't you see? This is exactly what they want. They're trying to make us sympathetic to their cause, to turn us against the Reich through false kindness. It's psychological warfare, more subtle than physical torture, but equally dangerous. Or, Hans suggested quietly, they're simply following their own military code, which apparently includes treating prisoners according to international law. Impossible, Klaus repeated, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. The next morning brought the same routine: orderly assembly, adequate breakfast, fair work assignments, and the morning after that, and the day following. The pattern of decent treatment continued without variation, gradually wearing down the prisoners' expectations of imminent brutality. Friedrich began writing letters home, carefully crafted to pass British censorship, while conveying basic information about his welfare. His first letter to his mother was brief and cautious. "I am well and healthy. The British treat us according to military law. Do not worry about me." Hans wrote to his wife in Hamburg, describing his situation with characteristic directness. "I am a prisoner of war in England. We receive adequate food, medical care when needed, and fair treatment. The British follow Geneva Conventions strictly. I am safer here than I would be continuing to fight." Klaus refused to write letters, claiming that any communication would be used for British propaganda purposes. But Hans noticed him listening intently when other prisoners read responses from their families, letters that had somehow reached Germany despite the chaos of war's final stages. Christmas Eve 1944 brought an unexpected development. Camp authorities announced that prisoners would be permitted to organize religious services, both Protestant and Catholic, in recognition of the holiday. German prisoners decorated a barracks with improvised ornaments made from scraps of paper and cloth, creating a simple but meaningful worship space. That evening, prisoners gathered for Protestant service, singing traditional hymns in German voices that carried across the camp in the cold winter air. They sang Stille Nacht, Silent Night, the melody drifting beyond the barbed wire to where British guards stood their posts. Hans watched through the window as several guards stopped and listened in respectful silence. When the song ended, he heard quiet applause from outside. A few minutes later, Corporal Thompson entered the barracks carrying a box of cigarettes and biscuits. "Happy Christmas, lads," Thompson said simply, distributing the gifts without ceremony or expectation of gratitude. "Thought you might appreciate a little extra tonight." The gesture was small but profound in its implications. These British soldiers, who had every reason to hate German prisoners, were showing basic human kindness during a religious observance. No regulations required such generosity. No military necessity demanded it. Friedrich accepted his cigarettes with tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he said in careful English. "This means very much to us." Thompson nodded and left without further comment, but his action resonated through the barracks long after he was gone. Klaus sat on his bunk, staring at the cigarettes in his hands, as if they were evidence of some incomprehensible phenomenon. "I don't understand," Klaus admitted finally, his voice barely audible. "We killed their soldiers, bombed their cities, supported a regime that committed terrible acts. Why do they treat us with kindness?" Hans had been pondering the same question for weeks. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "because they believe in something larger than revenge. Perhaps they're fighting for principles that require them to maintain civilized standards, even toward enemies. But we were taught that democracy makes people weak, that their Jewish-controlled governments would demand vengeance against German prisoners. Everything we learned about British character, about democratic weakness, about racial inferiority, was propaganda," Hans finished quietly. "Lies designed to make us fight harder by convincing us that surrender meant death or worse than death." The admission hung in the air like smoke from their Christmas cigarettes, carrying implications that extended far beyond their immediate situation. If Nazi propaganda about British treatment of prisoners was false, what else might be lies? The promises of miracle weapons, the claims about Jewish conspiracies, the entire ideological foundation of the regime they had fought for. Klaus spent the remainder of Christmas Eve staring at the ceiling, his worldview crumbling as he compared Nazi teachings with the reality of British fairness. Friedrich wrote another letter home, this one longer and more detailed, describing the Christmas service and the unexpected kindness of their captors. Hans reflected on the transformation he was witnessing, not just in his fellow prisoners, but in himself. The British had defeated them militarily, but they were also defeating them morally by demonstrating that civilization meant more than Nazi ideology had ever understood. In the days following Christmas, The pattern of fair treatment continued without variation. Adequate food, reasonable work assignments, medical care when needed, respect for basic human dignity. The British Guards maintained professional discipline without descending into cruelty, showing that strength could include restraint. Corporal Thompson became a frequent presence in their barracks, not as an interrogator or propagandist, but simply as a professional soldier doing his job with competence and basic human decency. Hans began engaging him in conversations about military service, finding common ground in shared experiences of combat and loss. "How long have you been a soldier?" Hans asked one evening as Thompson conducted routine inspection. 15 years regular army, Thompson replied. "North Africa, Italy, France, seen enough fighting to last several lifetimes, and you don't hate us? After everything we've done, all the destruction and death?" Thompson considered the question carefully. "I hate what your government did, what your army was ordered to do. But your soldiers, same as me, you followed orders, fought for your country as you understood it. Now you're prisoners, which makes you our responsibility. We don't abuse our responsibilities." "In Germany," Hans said slowly, "we were taught that British soldiers were cowards, that democratic armies lacked fighting spirit and military competence. Yet you defeated us." "Propaganda works both ways," Thompson observed. "Your side told you lies about us. Our side told us lies about you. Truth is, most soldiers are just ordinary men trying to do their duty and survive. The real evil comes from the top, from leaders who start wars and spread hatred." These conversations gradually expanded Hans's understanding of the conflict he had participated in. The British weren't the weak, decadent enemies described in Nazi propaganda. They were professional soldiers fighting for principles they believed in, maintaining civilized standards even when dealing with defeated enemies. Friedrich's transformation was even more dramatic. The frightened boy who had arrived expecting torture and starvation was becoming a confident young man who wrote detailed letters home describing British fairness and his own growing understanding of the war's true nature. "I was so afraid," he confided to Hans one evening. "The stories we heard, the propaganda about Allied brutality, made me terrified of capture. Instead, I'm safer here than I was fighting. I eat better, sleep in a real bed, receive medical care when sick. The British treat us better than our own officers did during the final battles." Klaus's transformation was more reluctant, but equally profound. The ardent Nazi believer was gradually acknowledging that everything he had been taught about racial superiority and democratic weakness was demonstrably false. The evidence of British competence and decency was overwhelming and undeniable. "I believed," Klaus said one night, his voice heavy with shame and confusion. "I truly believed in the Führer's teachings, in German racial superiority, in the necessity of our war against Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy. But if British are treating us fairly, despite having every reason for revenge, if they're maintaining civilized standards while we committed atrocities, then we were the barbarians," Hans finished gently, "and they are the civilized ones." The admission was painful, but liberating. For months, Klaus had been carrying the psychological burden of defending an indefensible ideology. Accepting the truth about British character meant accepting uncomfortable truths about German actions during the war. As winter gave way to early spring 1945, news filtered into the camp about Germany's deteriorating military situation. The Reich was collapsing, its armies in full retreat, its cities being bombed into rubble. The war that had promised German victory and racial dominance was ending in complete defeat. But for the prisoners in Camp 186, defeat had brought an unexpected education in civilization's true meaning. They had learned that strength could include restraint, that victory didn't require vengeance, and that treating enemies with dignity demonstrated greater civilization than any brutality could prove. Hans wrote his final letter from the camp in March 1945, as news of Germany's impending surrender reached even the isolated prisoners. "The war is ending, and we have lost everything we thought we were fighting for. But I have learned something valuable here in British captivity. I have seen what civilization really means, not from books or speeches, but from being imprisoned by people who practice civilized values, even toward men who fought against them. The British could have treated us brutally. We had fought against them, killed their soldiers, supported a regime that committed terrible acts. They had every moral justification for revenge. Instead, they treated us with firm fairness, that taught me more about democracy and human dignity than 12 years of Nazi education ever did. That restraint, that adherence to standards, even when dealing with enemies, that was real strength. When I return to Germany, I will remember this lesson about what civilization actually means. The quiet decency of British POW camps, where German prisoners received tea and fair treatment, where guards maintained order through discipline rather than terror, where enemies were treated as defeated soldiers rather than subhuman criminals, became testament to civilization's resilience under pressure. For Hans Mueller, Friedrich Weber, and even Klaus Richter, the experience of fair treatment when they expected brutality, of adequate food when they anticipated starvation, of professional respect when they feared torture, provided their first real encounter with functioning democratic civilization. The grey English mornings when German prisoners received proper rations and humane treatment demonstrated a truth more powerful than any propaganda, that real strength includes restraint, that victory doesn't require vengeance, and that treating enemies with dignity when you have defeated them shows greater civilization than any brutality could prove. In the end, Britain's victory over Nazi Germany was complete, not just militarily but morally, proven not through cruelty toward defeated enemies, but through maintaining civilized standards that demonstrated what the war had really been about: the defense of human dignity against those who would destroy it. If this story of unexpected humanity in the darkest of times moved you, please consider subscribing to our channel for more untold stories from history. Your subscription helps us continue bringing these powerful narratives to light. If you're already part of our community, a like would mean the world to us and helps others discover these important historical accounts. And we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever encountered a situation where reality completely contradicted your expectations? What other stories of humanity during wartime would you like us to explore?